P.2quared Journal, Entry 16, Helix, Part 7. Today is November 1st, 2021. Time is 7:22 a.m. So today I want to start discussing the macroscopic aspects of what this hypothesis being correct or being viable would have on the way that we look at relativistic mechanics and such, because that is a big part of the reason that I started looking into a different constituent for atomic matter was relativistic mechanics. Because the biggest issue I had with the general and special theory of relativity was the fact that we had no point of origin for space-time. Space-time was just this thing that was everywhere, and then when you threw dark energy into the mix, this thing that's everywhere is also growing everywhere. So it was something that I never understood. To compare that, if my understanding is correct, with the Helix hypothesis and how it handles the time dilation that space-time throws at us, you have a gravitational governor for every large celestial body. That would be the thing that space-time emanates from. So space-time isn't necessarily this thing that is everywhere, but space-time, as we understand it, would be the interaction between an object traveling through space and its gravitational governor. And here's why. So, as we discussed in the last entry, when you have a object, you would have a gravitational field, which we will draw like this, that is emanating out of it. That gravitational field is not just some random mathematical field. Instead, it's a field and it's a flow of gravitons coming out of the system. So when you travel through that field of gravitons, we'll just draw a little spaceship, you would actually be interacting with a higher number of gravitons as you get closer and closer to that object, making that object your gravitational governor, meaning that all relative mechanics are happening relative to that large object that you're interacting with. And this would be true of the entire universe. The entire universe would be giving off gravitons, and those gravitons would be the things that controls how much time dilation you are experiencing. The interesting part about that is it takes us back into a discussion of finite versus infinite universe, because if you have a infinite universe, you would experience time dilation to an extreme degree everywhere relative to infinity. It's a lot of So we won't get into that discussion today. That's something that I'm going to have to think a lot more about and come to a solid conclusion on. But because we have a situation where the closer you get to an object, the more likely it is that you will interact with one of its particles. These gravitons that are coming off of this particle, or that are coming off of this celestial body, we essentially can start conceptualizing our vehicles that are going to be traveling through large distances of space differently, because the time dilation effect that we're so worried about traveling through interstellar space is not a big deal at all, simply because we aren't actually going to experience a ton of time dilation. Time dilation is only an issue when you were close to a body. And it's like I said in the previous video, when you have a situation where let's turn that off, where all that we've done, if you once again look at the Earth, we've really tested heavily how light travels back and forth between 2 points on Earth, which is at the same gravitational level the whole time. And I've done a bit of research, not enough. So once again, this is just a brief entry. This isn't like solid, this should be thought based on this evidence. But because our satellites almost always have to pass their communications back and forth between us, meaning the Earth, and themselves, we would have a very hard time seeing that, especially because if the system is radiating gravity at the same speed, the same acceleration rate as it's radiating light, then when you send a message away from a planet, it will be traveling at a much faster rate than when it's traveling towards a planet. Because once it's traveling towards a planet, it's having to essentially swim upstream. And that swim upstream is going to slow down that communications relay significantly. So the time could be almost instantaneous traveling to a satellite, but it could be twice as long as we think that the whole thing is actually taking going back, just because it's having to go against the gravitic field instead of going with the gravitic field. So while this might seem like it doesn't have very much to do with the Helix particle, the very fact that we would have gravitons as the element that affects space-time as we know it would significantly change the way we would look at communications across the board. It would actually be more advantageous to it would actually be more advantageous to have systems in space communicate with systems in space. And it would also give us a reason to have stations in space that are away from gravitational governors that can communicate with other systems. Like a communications relay satellite would be an ideal thing to have, because it would be able to send information and receive information a lot quicker than a system on Earth. The system on Earth would still receive the delay, but if you had that station manned, then you could have, for example, interplanetary logistical systems that would be able to communicate between each other faster. Now, at this point, the few seconds or the few minutes that it takes information to travel is not a big deal. And we still have to consider the fact that we are in the sun's gravitational governance, and we can't really get away from that. So that's the brief on gravitational governance and how the Helix hypothesis affects that. I know that these are radical notions and things that are going to need to be proven extensively. You know, I know I'm suggesting throwing out about 100 years of successful Riemannian geometry, relativistic mechanics, but if we can get around it, our engineering abilities will be unhindered by the thought process that there are just certain things in the universe that can't be engineered. So even if this radical notion is completely moronic, the very fact that it might be true, and the very fact that we ourselves are our own greatest enemy when it comes to engineering interstellar ships, needs to be addressed. Because if we are the ones standing in our own way, we need to get out of our own way so that we can continue to expand the human race throughout the stars. So that's the end of this brief. We'll see you in the next one. We'll finish up Helix or a Helix hypothesis discussion here in the next few, and then we'll move on to some technologies. And I will eventually actually get started on studying the other stuff that I said I would study, so that we can start discussing that as well. So, see you in the next one.